Children are our future. At least that's what we're led to believe. But sometimes the hopes and aspirations we instill in our youth are snuffed out by an internal darkness that can only be described as evil. While some can't even comprehend the concept of killing another, history shows that sometimes even a child's mind can become fractured and dangerous. Do the following 3 stories prove that children are capable of killing? Or are they fictional tales of crimes that never took place? Well, it's up to you to figure it out, to decide what's fact or fiction.
The line that divides the factual from the unreal has long since blurred. The tales we once thought fantastical, now implanted as truth. To decipher verity from the imagined, you must break from the ordinary and consider a universe where the outlandish prevails. Can you expand your mind to see beyond our perceived reality? Can you decide what's fact or fiction?
Teenagers these days are angsty, filled with anger, and sometimes even fueled by rage. Brandon Hime experienced what happens when those common traits are combined with depression and trauma, leading to a strange night that he'll never forget.
As Hime let his sentencing sink in, he thought back to the day that wound up costing him the rest of his years. It was 3 years prior, and he can still remember the thoughts that ran through his head as he paced his room, the stinging in his shoulder throbbing through his arm. It wasn't the first time his father was rough with him, but on that day, Brandon wanted to make sure it was the last. The hammer was easy to find, and his father was exactly where he suspected, glued to the television, unaware of anything around him. His mother was due home any moment, so he planned to make it quick. As the noise of whatever midday program filled the living room, Brandon brought the hammer down on his father. In the haste of his swing, the metal missed its intended target, instead grazing Jerry Hime's ear before landing on his shoulder. Brandon cursed his aim, but before he could reposition his swing, his father was on top of him. The teenager's world turned red with rage, and the minutes that followed were a blur. He remembered hearing his mother's cries as she rushed in to separate the two, but he couldn't let her stop him. Credits rolled on the television, and Brandon found himself standing over his parents, blood pooling around their lifeless bodies. Instantly, he felt free and could think of only one way to celebrate. A quick phone call to his friends was all it took for the house party to be organized, and in the hours leading up to it, the young Hime cleaned up his mess. With no time to dispose of his parents' bodies, the bodies were moved to their bedroom, and with just enough time left, Brandon readied himself for the casual soiree. Friends started to gather at the Hime residence, and their host was there to greet them in a most hospitable way. He had not a care as the night went on, but there was an itch that no amount of socializing or alcohol could scratch. That's when he made his biggest mistake. The judge's words droned on, admonishing the now 20-year-old murderer as he delivered the life sentence. Brandon sat there and felt a pang of regret, not for killing his parents, but for being careless enough to tell a friend of the devilish deeds he performed just hours before the house party.
Teenagers are unpredictable, that's true. But would one be so careless as to host a party while his parents' bodies lay mere feet away? Could Brandon have been that thorough with his cleanup that there wouldn't be a speck of blood for any partygoers to see? maybe everyone was too preoccupied with friends and loud music to notice anything out of the ordinary. We'd love to hear what you think, so let us know in the comments. But before we reveal whether Brandon's story was real or not, we'd like to take you to a small, snowy town to introduce you to Tiffany Tomlin and Susan Wallace, two girls brought together under unfortunate circumstances. As the two grew to know one another, it's clear that their relationship will never last, especially as one of them holds a deadly secret.
When Tiffany came to live with Susan, their relationship started off surprisingly well. Welcoming her 10-year-old cousin into her home, 12-year-old Susan did what she could to make Tiffany comfortable. Weeks prior, Tiffany suffered the loss of her father, a freak accident that was still a very fresh, open wound in the young girl's heart. Susan avoided the subject and instead welcomed Tiffany into her world without hesitation. But as their relationship budded, Tiffany started to see something about Susan that unsettled her. She was obsessed with death. Susan contemplated it, wondered how her parents would eventually be taken from her, and she somehow found a way to sneak it into just about every conversation. Tiffany soon found that Susan didn't just think about death, she took part in it. Like Tiffany, the Wallaces were still grieving over the loss of their adolescent son, Caleb. Tammy Wallace, Susan's mother, left the 4-year-old only for a minute, and it seemed impossible that, in that time, he had slipped under the shallow water and drowned. She ran the scenario through her head time and time again, each time landing on it being a freak accident. As Tiffany grew closer to Susan, the older girl grew bolder, eventually showing off the tugboat that Caleb had in the tub with him the night he drowned. It was a missing link that the Wallaces could never find after his death. Eventually, Tiffany grew uneasy with Susan's talk of death and the possession of her dead brother's toy. While Susan slept one night, she brought the boat to Tammy and talked about her darker thoughts. Tammy feared the worst, but couldn't fathom that her daughter had played a part in Caleb's death. Under the guise of helping her cope with her brother's death, Tammy had Susan speak with a psychologist. During one session, the truth slipped, a small nugget of information that put Susan in the bathroom with her brother as water filled his lungs. It was her small hand that held him underwater so, as she put it, she could see what death looked like.
Is such a young mind capable of killing in such a horrific way? Or did we conjure up this story just to mess with your head? We want to hear what you think. But while you plan your response, consider a few things. Did no one question where Caleb's toy tugboat went? Or were they too distracted by his passing to even consider it? Would someone as young as Tiffany even notice Susan's macabre thoughts? Or did her father's death mature her? Before we get to the reveal, there's one last story of murderous children, and this one's frightening. Children can be influenced, but what if the figure directing them to kill is a fictitious character? Freddie Hadley and Tate seemed like regular children, but their imaginary friend ensured they be remembered as anything but normal.
At first, Tate was confused by Freddie's proposal. He had heard of Slender Man before, but only as an internet character, and yet here his best friend was talking as if he really existed. He was enthusiastic about the tall, faceless man in a suit, filled Tate in on all the hidden details he discovered while browsing the internet, and eventually grew ecstatic when he got to what he considered the best part. He wants to help kids. There's this, he paused, searching for the right word, this castle in the forests that he lives in. If we do what he says, he'll let us live with him, and we won't ever have to worry about anything. Tate considered what he was being told, and though deep down he knew it to be too fantastical, Freddie had never steered him in the wrong direction. Maybe there was a place they could escape to, somewhere away from their stifling parents and school bullies and pushy teachers. Tate was on board, and with the one question he had for Freddie, he spiraled down a rabbit hole of madness that would forever ruin his life. What do we have to do? Tate asked hesitantly, cautious about what this mysterious figure required of his subjects. Kill. Freddie was cold when he said it, uncaring and already determined to enjoy his life in the castle in the woods. When he saw Tate's horrified reaction, Freddie continued with the hard sell, reminding his friend of the time his parents sold his Nintendo DS because of his bad grades. He brought up Tate's soft spot, a girl that had completely embarrassed him by rather loudly rejecting him at a school dance. It finally hit Tate what Freddie was doing. Slender Man was a vessel for the two to grow stronger, and agreeing to kill for him was more symbolic than an act they'd actually carry out. He held on to that belief until the following weekend when the two were enjoying themselves at the nearby park. It was quiet, save for a group of girls about 2 years younger. When Freddie noticed them, he silently nudged Tate and produced a knife he had hidden in his shoe. Tate continued to follow him, knowing they were just going to scare the girls off. But when Freddie charged the group and tackled one girl to the ground, something felt incredibly wrong. "Hold her down, Tate," Freddie called out. And while the girls' friends yelled and cried, Tate got lost in the confusion and held her arms down. The first spot of blood hit his wrist and soaked into his sleeve as Freddie plunged the knife into the girl's chest over and over again. Even 7 years later, Tate can still hear her choking on her own blood. Despite countless hours of mandatory therapy and years of listening to the stories of other prisoners, nothing can ever drown the noise out.
Kids are impressionable, and the internet can be a deep web of deception and misinformation. But can those two things come together and cause a 12-year-old to murder? Is it possible that Tate and Freddie committed an atrocious act on their own will and tried to use a fictitious character as an alibi? Let us know what you think about this story in the comments.
Are you ready to find out if you can decipher between fact or fiction? Let's look back at tonight's 3 stories and find out which were born from reality and which were fabrications of the imagination.
Let's think back to Brandon Hime, the boy who allegedly killed his parents and immediately threw a house party at the crime scene. Do you think this story actually happened? If you said yes, then it's possible you've heard of Fort Pierce, Florida teenager Tyler Hadley, who inspired the story of Hime. In July of 2011, Hadley murdered his parents with a hammer, and later that evening invited friends over for a party. After bragging to a friend about the murder, Hadley was arrested and sentenced to life in prison. He's been known to sign autographs as Hammer Boy and claims that he talks with the devil. Can you go 2 for 2 and correctly determine if Susan Wallace really did kill her 4-year-old brother, Caleb? If you said it was true, sorry to say, you killed your winning streak. Not only is it a fake story, perceptive individuals may sense the inspiration from the 1993 thriller starring Macaulay Culkin, The Good Son. In our third story about Tate, if Freddie and Slender Man didn't have you fearing the susceptible and twisted minds of children, that's okay, because it wasn't real. At least not entirely. The story mimics the real-life case of 12-year-old Peyton Leutner, whose friends, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire, attempted to murder her in order to live with Slender Man. Peyton, however, survived the attack, despite being stabbed 19 times.
How well did you do in tonight's video? Did you look past the deception of our world and define the off-blurred line that struggles to separate lies from the truth? Let us know in the comment section below. And should you find the urge to test your perceptions again, be sure to subscribe and join us next time when we ask you to decide what's fact or fiction.